piece of upscaling delivery of nature-based solutions. Today is Nature Day. I think it's felt for me like a conversation that has been sort of building all week and has sort of started to really come to a head today. And there have been some great discussions, which I feel are really moving forward the dialogue and debate around nature-based solutions. We have a fabulous panel here today, representatives from Wales, from Scotland, from England and Northern Ireland. And I think that is significant and important. We've talked a lot about collaboration during this week, and this feels like one of those collaborations that is already doing a lot of good and where there is a huge potential for us to do more. And I think it feels right that this discussion is happening in this pavilion, the Multilevel Action Pavilion, home to subnationals, nations and regions. And I think that actually there's real strength in this. We feed off each other, we challenge each other, we learn from each other. And I certainly find being part of this gang of nature conservation bodies from across the UK hugely inspiring, hugely engaging. And we are all together working to deliver the future of nature-based solutions. I'm going to call on Pete Brotherton from English Nature first, Natural England. I always get, I was thinking, don't get it wrong, Claire, don't get it wrong, but I did. Never mind. Pete Brotherton from Natural England, who with the other agencies over the last year, maybe, I don't know when we started talking about it first, has been working on the document which we published a month or so ago called Nature Positive. And I think it'd be really good, Pete, if you could come and tell us all about it. I'm going to drop this mic and swap places with you. Oh, Pete, reminding me that behind me, there is a thing that you can ask questions on through Slido. We will have questions in the room, but we will also take questions online. So thank you, Pete, for organising that and prompting me.
Thank you. And thank you, Claire, for that generous introduction. This week, I've been really amazed by how much we've heard about nature. I came thinking this was going to be about climate change and worrying that nature was going to be left out of the conversation, and it hasn't happened at all. And what we've heard is world leaders and people across the whole conference really firmly getting behind the scientific consensus that we either become nature positive and net zero together. We approach that together by tackling the joint crises of climate change and biodiversity loss together, or we will tackle neither. And so this whole agenda of becoming nature positive is a climate change agenda. So it's really great to be talking about that today. If I could have the next slide, please. So just to get us on the same page, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying nature positive. So nature is declining across much of the world. In the UK, over 40% of species are in decline, and we're still seeing losses of habitats. So we're still on a downward trajectory. And we need to turn that curve. We need to move from being on the way down to turning the curve. That is not an endpoint. And it's really important to say that. Becoming nature positive isn't an endpoint. We have a legacy of nature loss that we need to pay back. We have a long debt of nature loss that needs to be paid back so that we can hopefully become nature rich at some time in the future. Let's hope by 2050. And that's broadly what the strategic plans for the CBD is saying. Could I have the next slide, please? The context to the report, Nature Positive 2030, are some of the really important promises that have been made over the past year. So on the left of your screen is the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, now signed by 92 countries around the world, and very much saying that we will tackle the systemic causes of the loss of nature. Broadly around the same time, the 30 by 30 pledges arrived as well, the High Ambition Coalition promising to protect 30% of our land and sea for nature by 2030. When you dig into these pledges, they're fantastic. They're far-reaching. They talk about systemic change in terms of how we approach our relationship and management and use of nature. But we've had promises before. And what the agencies of the UK have done by getting together is to say, we will take those pledges at face value. We will take those promises, and drawing on our experiences, we will say how you can succeed in delivering those promises. So that these do not have to be more promises that sit on the shelf of broken promises that there have been since Rio over nearly 30 years ago. Could I have the next slide, please? And the report documents how success can happen. And very clearly that when we get the conditions right, nature can recover quickly. So on the left-hand side is a picture from Cairngorms Connect, the largest habitat restoration project in the UK, happening here in Scotland, where river restoration, wetland restoration, better management of woodlands, and some predator control and grazing control is leading to huge areas of habitat restoration. The middle is a picture of a purple emperor butterfly, the largest population anywhere in the UK of that butterfly is in a place called Knepp, a Knepp estate, which was an intensively and failing agricultural holding in England up until 20 years ago. That has now been turned around through reintroduction of naturalistic grazing management, and we're seeing fantastic delivery of nature within 10, 20 years time periods. The last pictures of our marine environments. When we stop trashing the marine environment, it recovers. Surprise, surprise. Areas such as Lyme Bay and so on, where we have removed the particularly harmful demersal fishing practices, where we destroy the benthic communities, have shown how quickly even those communities can recover. Could I have the next slide? But we know that there is a massive action gap, and the report tackles that across three main areas. And I won't go into massive detail here, but we address the need to mainstream nature recovery. So this is about really changing our relationship and putting nature at the heart of the way we look after our health, the way we look after our well-being, embedding the values of nature in the decisions across society, including by aligning our action for climate change and nature. And in this conference, I need to say a little more about that. The major reason that nature has been lost, particularly in the UK, but in many countries, is because we've starved it from space. We've starved it of space. And our next topic that we tackle is the need to protect and better restore nature through setting and meeting ambitious targets. The 30 by 30 target is an interesting one. In many countries for land, the debate is which 30% do we protect? Which is the best 30% that we should select? In the UK, we don't have 30% of wildlife rich habitat left. So we do need to protect what's left. We need to work, but we also need to restore and think about where we restore and build new habitats to get to that 30%. And the third area that we tackle in considerable detail is around how we move to much more sustainable land and sea use. So we consider how fishing, how agriculture, how our forestry management, how pollution can be better managed, and draw upon great examples of where we're beginning to see glimmers of hope. such as by tackling the cumulative impacts of multiple sources of pollution at a strategic scale, so that we don't live by the death of 1,000 cuts that we've got used to living by, and genuinely solve pollution-related issues. And pollution is a massive driver of nature loss in the UK and globally. If I could have the next slide, please. We conclude that there are real good reasons to be hopeful, that we're seeing policy change from our governments, and that are really encouraging, that we are on a good track. Perhaps most notably are the 6 examples I'm about to give. So there is a commitment to repurpose our harmful agricultural subsidies so that they're no longer just supporting farmer production and in fact encouraging greater intensification, but moving to paying farmers the same amount of money maybe, but paying them for the recovery of biodiversity and the delivery of other public benefits. That could redirect over £3 billion into nature. I've been quite involved in calculating the amount of money needed to restore nature in the UK. We've never come up with a number as high as that. So if we make good on that promise, there's reasons to be hopeful. If we make good on that promise. We also have a new Fisheries Act, which again tackles the issue of fisheries subsidies and embeds an ecosystem-based approach into fisheries management and a focus on achieving good environmental status of our seas. Again, hugely encouraging. It's early days, but if this is implemented well, there's a lot to be hopeful for. We're seeing an approach to the fragmented and frankly tiny nature reserves that we have in the UK. So many of our protected areas, well, the average protected area in England, 70% of them are less than 100 hectares in size. So we have lots of small places that we need to think about how we connect and how we manage as a network rather than individual places. So rolling out a well-planned nature network to underpin that 30 by 30 commitment on land and sea. In our seas, we now have about 36% of the UK seas within protected areas, but at the moment, a lot of them are just on paper. We need to get those well managed, and setting out how we can achieve that is one of the things the report does. Could I have the next slide? We're beginning to introduce legally binding targets in part of the UK. Next week, we hope to hear that in England, there will be a legally binding target for species by 2030. This is really exciting because it can help mobilize resource. I heard today our Scottish minister start opening Nature Day in the UK Pavilion, saying that the Scottish government is committed to becoming nature positive by 2030. So we're seeing nature positive being embedded in policies, which is really exciting. And it's so important because we have legally binding targets for climate change. That will drive funding decisions. We need nature to be on the same footing. So legally binding targets for nature are critical for those legally binding targets for climate change to succeed. We need both. We're seeing growing use of green and blue infrastructure to deliver outcomes in the places where people live. So we know that they hold great opportunity for our health and well-being and our economy. And really, we should be looking to nature first for a lot of the solutions that we need from society, thinking about natural infrastructure alongside grey infrastructure. And in some parts of the UK, built development is now, there's a policy that requires built developments to deliver net gain for biodiversity. And last but not least, we're seeing growing deployment of nature-based solutions, notably large commitments for tree planting, moving up to 30,000 hectares per year, looking to increase the extent of woodlands across the UK from currently around 13% to 17% by 2035, effective coastal and water management as well to deliver for climate change and biodiversity. Could I have the next slide, please? All of those are great, but many of them are on the slow burn. Many of them are still being introduced progressively. And they will not, we conclude in our report, they're really important. It's really important we see through with those, but we will not get there. They will not deliver for 2030. So we also in our report identify 9 things that governments can do now. And I think these, You know, clearly we've directed them first and foremost at the UK governments, but these I think may travel. They have relevance in other countries as well. 9 priority actions that the UK governments can do now and need to do now to get us to becoming nature positive by 2030. Because we're confident that it's not too late to become nature positive by 2030, provided we do act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete, for setting the scene in that way. And now for our second presentation, can I invite Clive Walmsley from Natural Resources Wales to come up and talk a bit more about the detail of nature-based solutions, and then we'll go into the panel discussion.
Thank you, Claire. So as Claire says, I'm going to kind of take over from where Pete left off. Obviously, he talked about one of the 9 actions that we need to take, being the delivery of nature-based solutions. And as we sit here in the Multi-Level Action Pavilion, which is obviously hosted by Scottish Government and ICLEI, which is the local government fora for sustainability, which has over 2,500 local and regional governments across 125 countries involved in it. Including Welsh Government and Scottish Government. Just reflecting on that, they have a mission for ICLEI for low emissions, equitable, resilient, and circular development, and importantly, nature-based. And the ICLEI network is involved in peer exchange, partnerships, and capacity building. But I think one of the key points is that both at multiple levels, it's important for agencies to do exactly the same. And next slide, please. And it's the agencies from across the, if we can go for the next slide, please. It's the agencies from across the UK. So you've got the 5 agencies there that are have been involved in what's been established for quite some time, the UK Interagency Climate Change Group. And that group seeks to, if you like, provide the same kind of exchange and partnerships and capacity building across and learning across the 5 agencies. And then with the advent of the goal of net zero, and recognizing because of net zero, getting the net bit into zero, the importance of nature-based solutions and how we manage the landscape. We've also collaborated more recently since the advent of net zero being a policy across the UK with the other agencies. So that's the Environmental Protection Agency, the Environment Agency, SEPA in Scotland, and also with the forestry agencies from across the UK. And that wider collaboration is something which is evolving. Equally importantly, we're a significant number of the agencies involved here are also within other partnerships. The ENCA, which is the heads of the European Nature Conservation Agencies, and NRW as a combined agency, actually unique within Europe, I think, combining the nature conservation, environmental protection, and forestry functions, but we're also involved in the EPA network. And one of the things that having that involvement in both networks revealed really was the common interest in nature-based solutions. This was something that actually came up within the 2 networks, which I've been involved with for many years, about 4 or 5 years ago. And both networks saw this as a really priority area. And so we organized, I was involved in organizing a workshop in Wales, in Cardiff, where we brought together the two networks to share learning and collaboration. And that was really productive, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. But I thought it was just useful to set out the fact that that collaboration is something that we are gradually building. And in fact, this morning, the Isle of Man government said it was interested in joining the interagency network. So I'm now going to move on. Next slide, please, to just give you a flavour of some of the nature-based solution case studies that the interagency group has actually gathered together. We've gathered together some 33 case studies from across the UK, from each of the 4 nations. And we've then distilled those down to a set of 12, which we've actually published some details on the pages of the JNCC website, so where more details. But I just want to kind of run through a few, just to give you a flavor of them, some pretty pictures as well. And the first one is Remedies, which is a project in southern England, a marine project looking to restore seagrass beds. Seagrass beds being critical endangered habitat, which has reduced in area significantly over the last century, which can provide, it does provide carbon storage. It also provides a habitat which for other wildlife species, and also as a fish spawning ground. So next slide, please. We've also got examples where the development of renewables here at Penycumwy in South Wales have actually provided the funds and the partnerships working with the local community to restore uplands, so both peatlands and other upland habitats across the South Wales valleys. Next slide, please. So this is the Great Fen project, which is actually a really important project, which is looking to link two existing fens through a restoration project, which will ensure that it delivers greater connectivity and therefore greater resilience to the fen system in East Anglia. Next slide, please. And this is a view, again, I think it's important to stress that nature-based solutions are not just about the rural areas. They're really important in the context of urban areas too. And this is a view of one street in the Greener Grangetown project, which is a project which has created 125 rain gardens and with lots of tree planting, with the streets being revised to increase road safety, so to slow traffic and improve active travel, but very much in partnership with the community. Next slide, please. And this is an example of an image from a Scottish example, which is the Green Infrastructure Strategic Intervention, which has involved 15 major green infrastructure projects across Scotland, and particularly engaging with 11 communities across Scotland. So kind of very much building on what the work that has happened previously. And if we can go to the next slide, please. This is from Northern Ireland. This is the East Mournes wildfire project, which is actually a really good example of a project which is seek to look at climate risk from a climate risk perspective, and identified that fire resilience is really important within these habitats. And by managing gateways and areas where fire could rush through the upland areas, and by managing the amount of material in those areas, it's been able to kind of reduce fire risk. And although it was certainly in the media in the UK, there were significant fires here in the recent past, it wasn't within this area that was managed through this project. And actually there seems to be good evidence that this was an effective deterrent to managed fire. And then moving on, next please. And you've actually, I think you might have seen, this is Cairngorms Connect, which is already been mentioned, so I won't dwell on it, but I think this is a really good project because it has a 200-year vision, and it's looking to work at scale. It's looking across the landscape to have habitats and natural processes restored across 600,000 hectares. So next slide, please. So I've given you a flavor of some of the 33 case studies that we've gathered through our UK network. And now I just want to focus on 5 critical points. before we go into our panel session. So these come from a report that I talked about that we published with the EPA and the ENCA networks, but with the full involvement of all of the UK agencies. And the first one I want to flag up is the importance of the evidence base, and which is critical to the long-term viability of delivering nature-based solutions. And there are many nature-based solutions for which we do have a strong evidence base, such as woodland creation and peatland restoration, but there are major gaps, particularly in other habitats, and that's something that we definitely need to plug. Next slide, please. And when we think about, there are a number of definitions of nature-based solutions, but a common feature of the definitions is around the importance of multiple benefits, co-benefits, whatever you want to call them. But I think there's a need for, and one of the things that we really felt strongly about collectively from across Europe, is that the importance of a holistic approach to identifying what those benefits are and being able to value them, and so to be able to kind of increasingly value the significance of using a nature-based approach. Next slide, please. And while there are, I mean, I mentioned Cairngorms Connect, but while there are some larger scale case studies, that there is really a relative paucity of large scale examples. Many of them are relatively small. So being able to work at scale and demonstrate that NBS works at scale is really, really important going forwards, and was something that the agencies felt quite strongly about. Moving on. Next slide. And I think we'll probably come on to this in the panel discussion, but mobilizing and informing stakeholders, politicians, shakers and movers in communities of the value of NBS, communicating what NBS is also really critical. And we know from experience with things which are badged as rewilding projects, sometimes the community is very, very opposed to those kind of things. So being able to communicate what NBS is and the advantages of it is really critical. Next slide, please. And finally, improving and understanding the appreciation of risks and benefits. I think it's really important that we stress the fact that clearly nature-based solutions can deliver in many ways, but there are limits. There are limits to what it can deliver. And just in thinking of the example that we deal with in NRW of flood risk and using landscape scale changes in terms of buffer strips or planting trees and so on. Yes, clearly that can mitigate and reduce peak flows in rivers, but it isn't necessarily the answer. So a combination of green and grey solutions are often going to be required, and it's important that we recognise that. Next slide, please. And finally, this is just a slide of the Interagency Climate Change Group, the last time pre-COVID that we met, not far away from here at Portmoak Moss in Scotland. And going forward, what the group is going to be looking at is particularly looking at I haven't mentioned it yet, but the IUCN standard and kind of standards around NBS and the development of principles, a simple set of principles that we feel will help drive action. So with that, I will close and hand back to Claire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. And I think that set us up for a really good discussion. And so can I invite the panel to join me up here? So Sophie Howe, Clive Mitchell, Paul Donnelly, Marion Spain, and Clive Walmsley. So what I'm going to ask actually of each of you is to introduce yourselves, but also, I think those two presentations really set out some of the opportunities and the challenges around nature-based solutions. And I'd just be really interested from each of you to hear sort of what you're thinking about is the sort of one thing that you think would make a big difference at this point. Because I think what we've been hearing during the course of the day is the value of nature-based solutions. And I think it's how we upscale them, how we make them something that is mainstream rather than, you know, something that is perhaps smaller scale and valued, but not seen as something that is just how we do things around here. So I'm going to turn to Clive first. Is that working?
Is it working? I think, okay, great.
Good.
Yeah, so many Clives in one space. It's a rare event. Thank you. I'm Clive Mitchell. I work for Nature Scott as an outcome manager for nature and climate. So the first thing I want to say in terms of nature-based solutions and the context of this conference is that nature isn't like any other sector of emission reductions. Nature effectively regulates the global carbon system and therefore global climate. So when we talk about nature, we mean all life everywhere, not just the bits of it in protected areas and priority habitats and species, but all of it, especially through the things that happen in soils that do all of that regulation between the slow and the fast parts of a global carbon system. So we need to be much more alive to the diversity of nature and its resilience in the face of a changing climate, some of which is inevitable. And as people have said throughout the conference, we need to tackle both nature and climate together, or we end up tackling neither. There's a huge question, as well as operating at a landscape scale, then about how we integrate nature-based solutions with all of the other things that we need and want from the land. And of course, accepting that we are going to get some losses through floods, fires, drought, and so on, we need to think about how we overinvest in restoring nature in order to provide the benefits for mitigation, adaptation, and state of nature all at the same time on the same land. That's the bar I'm setting for the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you, Clive. And that whole issue of land use and the multiple pressures on it will, I'm sure, be a feature of this conversation. Paul, welcome, and welcome to your new role. It's very good to have you here.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome everyone this afternoon. It's good to be here. Paul Donnelly, recently appointed Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Environment Agency. I suppose for me, relatively new to this, I think I agree with your opening comments. It's been very positive, I think, in relation to nature and placing it front and center, I believe, over the last few days. I suppose there is a huge opportunity for everyone, but if you were to ask me what do I think is the most important, and you may say he would say that as a civil servant, but I do think it is about trying to turn this positivity and the pledges into policy and legislation. You know, let's get some hard targets that we will all continue to do good things and do great work, but can we get the policymakers to turn it into hard targets that we can all strive to achieve? I believe, you know, we're definitely on the crest of a wave. I think the positivity is there. I'm going to come up with another idea. I hope I don't steal anybody else's thunder, but I think you talked as well about collaboration, and I think collaboration is key across the piece. Collaboration between the agencies, which is great to see on a UK basis, because we can share ideas and we can learn, which is vitally important, but also collaboration top down and bottom up, and others have mentioned communities, and I think there is a huge opportunity to get communities involved as well at that grassroots level, because ultimately it's about behavioral change and getting people on board. So hugely positive from my perspective. Well done to everyone for getting this event together today as well. I think it's a great opportunity to be here. So look forward to working with you all going forward, but I'm definitely going to be leaving here positive And I think it's a very positive time for nature recovery and nature positive.
Thank you, Paul. You won't find any quibbles from me about being a boring civil servant about these things. There is a place for inspiration and the great ideas. What makes them happen is good policy making and good legislation that underpins change. And I think we can't underestimate that. So thank you for raising that. Marion, turning to you next. I'm actually, Clive, I'm going to deprive you of having this slot, having had a good sort of go at it earlier. So Marion, then I'll come to Sophie. Do you need that?
I think I do need that. Can people hear me? I'm going to try not to repeat what others have said, but I will echo a couple of things. I have been just bowled over by the positivity of the conversations at this conference in the last couple of days. All of the UK ministers talking about this, but also hearing all of the other countries talking about bringing nature and climate together. You know, this is a worldwide movement. That's what's rather blown my mind away. So there's that huge positivity. The other thing, I went to a lunchtime reception today organized by DEFRA with 100 major businesses who were committing, frankly, mind-boggling sums of money to funding nature-based solutions. They're now seeing this as part of their own, dealing with their own environmental footprint, but also as part of their social responsibilities. So from food retailers to fashion to insurance and banking. And I didn't tally all the numbers I heard, but I think they'd make my annual budget look like peanuts. So that's the other thing that strikes me. There is money for this. And that, I think, is what brings me to what we now need to do. In order to start to make this happen, we've now got to find the land. And 70% of land in the UK is owned by private individuals. We can't do this just on ENGO land or government-owned land. So the urgency for me now is to really start engaging our farming and land management community, because they own the land and they own the solutions. They also, if we have, as we heard from Pete, there's an opportunity for them now to see this as a business, either because, as Pete was telling us earlier, those changes in agricultural policy mean government is now paying for nature, but the businesses I was with at lunch are keen to pay for nature. So but I don't think many of our farmers yet understand that opportunity, nor do they understand the power they have in their hands to tackle both climate change and nature together. I met a farmer in Devon recently who said to me, I farm beef and I also farm wildlife. And I thought, gosh, if every farmer in Britain thought that, we'd be in a much better place. Sorry, in the UK, thought that we'd be in a much better place. So that's the main thing I want to do, is get out there and start talking to farmers about they are now part of the solution, they are part of the future, and to bring their communities with them.
Thank you very much, Marion. And that engagement with land managers, I think, is absolutely key going forward. Now, turning to Sophie, Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. You and I have had lots of conversations during the last couple of days and indeed over the last few years. And in a way, you are bringing a different perspective to this panel. We are all deeply steeped in the practice. You are seeing it within that much wider sense of a just transition for Wales and indeed for other countries. And I'd be really interested in your perspective on, you know, what you've heard today and what you think that single point of action should be.
So for me, I think the kind of key word is connection, and people have already talked about that. To put that into context in terms of the job that that I do and the legislation that we have in Wales, it does a number of things. Protecting the interests of future generations is the main one, but it also requires us to improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, and to see the connections between those things in the long term, to prevent problems from occurring or happening or getting worse, collaborating with others and involving citizens. And I think that kind of those long-term connections are the things that have been missing actually, but are also the things that, if we get them right, can help to drive some real action. So the fact that you know, the climate emergency doesn't hit people equally. It's not caused by the people who are the most marginalized and the most vulnerable in society, and yet they pay the highest cost. Likewise, in terms of nature, if you're living in a poorer community, or if you're from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic community in the UK, you are far less likely to have access to nature. You're far more likely to be living in areas of high air pollution. And you're far more likely in those communities to have lower levels of life expectancy. So I think that the critical issue here is, how do we see those connections, and how do we upskill people who are taking decisions, not just necessarily at a kind of, national or strategic level, but how do we get the people who are taking decisions every day in our local authorities, in our other organizations, to be taking those decisions in an eco-literate manner. And that means that we have to be able to communicate things simply to them. We have to be able to communicate the nature emergency. We have to be able to communicate how that links back to the specific work that they are doing. And the really good example that you saw that Clive shared, I think, is one of those occasions where that has happened. Greener Grangetown. What happens? That Greener Grangetown scheme started by looking at how do we solve a problem with traffic congestion in Cardiff. Now, quite remote from nature in some ways, but what happened then is, due to the requirements of our legislation, the public health consultant was seconded from the health board to the council to lead on the development of a transportation strategy. And when you apply a public health lens to what is a transport problem, you get a completely different set of solutions. So in that part of Cardiff, high levels of Black, Asian, minority ethnic community, a poor community, 10 years difference in levels of life expectancy from the richest parts of Cardiff to that area. And then you bring in cycle routes, you bring in cleaning and greening the community, you bring in the people who are dealing with sustainable urban drainage, and you bring in experts on greening and restoring nature in urban communities, and you start to address multiple problems. You start to reduce levels of air pollution. That impacts on levels of life expectancy. That impacts on the fact that those communities don't have access, or haven't previously had access to nature on their doorsteps, and many, many more things. And it also gets us to that end point, or the starting point, which was reducing congestion in the city. So that's the space that we've got to be in. We need to be reaching outside of our comfort zones. We need to be talking to unusual suspects and bringing different people on board as part of building collective multiple win solutions to the challenges we face, no matter what the starting point of that challenge is.
Thank you, Sophie. Great sort of set of sort of issues that I think we can tease out a bit more in the coming minutes. But something that came out of Clive's presentation, and I think others have sort of touched on, is the importance of evidence, the importance of having that underpinning evidence base from which we can build solutions, but also having the practical skills to be able to deliver the change that we're looking for. And I mean, Marion, you've been sort of battling with this for much of your career, actually. And I suppose it's that, are the major gaps, how do we fill them? But also that, how do we not allow ourselves to be daunted by the lack of evidence and therefore fall into a sort of inactivity while we gather that evidence?
The short answer is, Claire, I don't think we need to wait. We know enough. We know an awful lot now. We know technically how to restore these habitats. We know what physical work you do on the ground, let's put it that way. And we also know for quite a lot of habitats, particularly through the work of scientists working with the interagency group that we've been hearing about, we know we can calculate the carbon benefits of quite a lot of those habitats. I think there's two areas we probably need to know more about, and one is a fine grain point and one is a big scale point. I think on the fine grain point, we are still not always confident enough to make a very specific binary land use choice. So those farmers I was talking about earlier, if I'm a farmer, am I going to be better off restoring species-rich permanent pasture? Am I going to be better off planting deciduous or coniferous trees? Or am I going to be better off changing the way I farm if I want to do this for carbon? So I think being able to produce a simple calculator that would allow a farmer to make the right choice, and also allow those others of us who are making land use choices. You know, in England, we in the Forestry Commission, our colleagues in the Forestry, we still do not agree on the evidence base. We are still having daily tussles on what we do about trees on peatland. So there are certainly some fine grain evidence things we need to get over, but not wait, do the things we know about. I think the other reason I think that evidence matters for farmers, well, all of us as land managers, some of the changes we're asking these land managers to make are quite big. We're not asking them to tweak their farming systems. Some of them we're asking them to fundamentally change the nature of their land use. And these are lifetime decisions. Trees, peat, permanent pasture are lifetime decisions. So I think we owe it to people to have that certainty. I think the other scale that we don't yet know, we don't, apart from places like Cairngorms Connect, we don't often do this at big scale. We've done it on a nature reserve or on an individual farm. So that's the next step for me, is really understanding how this works at landscape scale and making sure we thought about possible unintended consequences. What will those changes in land use do to drainage and rivers and so on, for example? And that's why in England, we are very pleased to have got some reasonably chunky money from our government this year to pilot 5 big landscape scale projects to really understand the science and really understand the impact and any unintended negative impacts.
Thank you, Marion. Clive, come to you and the sort of Scottish experience around this.
Thanks. So yeah, there are some, as I'm going to echo quite a lot of what Marion said. I think that there are some fine scale data gaps in relation to peatlands, for example, substituting planted peatlands and the restoration benefits of that. But as a general point, the point I want to echo from Marion is that we shouldn't get bogged down in data before we act. We found, you know, if you look at the narrative around climate change for the last 30 years, we've known the problem for 30 years and we've finessed the data, which has been hugely important, but at the arguably, and I think at the expense of appropriate action. So it's clear for nature-based solutions that we need to act soon. And we need to do that so that they accumulate benefits for future generations. And we also need to decide, we also need to demonstrate the impact of those interventions, and we need to design that in to the interventions when we start. And that also ties to the, if we want those benefits to those interventions to bring multiple benefits, we need to bring a wide constituency of people into designing the intervention as well. So it's crucial that we address that point of procedural justice, I think, that Sophie was making, and ensuring that we have a wide constituency of stakeholders in designing these interventions. And things are going to change as these interventions develop over time. So we need to be quite adaptive and flexible in how we learn from them and how we then further inform the management of those interventions on an ongoing basis. So a commitment to nature-based solutions isn't a one-off gesture. It's very much about how we manage the land and use it for multiple benefits for people and nature and climate in the long term.
Thank you, Clive. I was going to say, you've both sort of in a way referred to some of those sort of tensions that can emerge between sort of specialists and experts. It is one of the joys that I live with in NRW, is that we have to do that internally, and sometimes it gets quite feisty, but it is possible to reach resolution and, you know, on the basis of the evidence, take good decisions. I think the adaptive piece is really important, you know, moving things forward, adapting, learning from it and moving on. But Paul, I mean, there's also the skills issue, and I think, you know, I'd be interested in hearing from you on that perspective of, do we have the skills? Do we need to do more? Where do we need to focus ourselves?
I think all of that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would agree. I think, you know, where there's a phrase we would use, and it's policy by doing. And, you know, I know we all talk about that. I think we're past the point of refining the evidence. You know, we refine it as we do it. And there requires a bit of courage there as well, you know, to people to take risks, you know, to do things that may not work out, but that's how you learn, you know. And I think hopefully, I think through events like this, and I say the positivity at the minute, we've created that space, I think, whereby we can actually get on and do things, you know, refine the evidence. But you're absolutely right as well. You know, I think there is a skills issue, you know, at all levels, right down to, I suppose Marion talked about our farmers and their key stakeholder. We have to get them on board. And so I think, you know, as we talk about, you know, incentivization, but education is a huge piece. And I think across the piece, we really do have to get boots on the ground, as they talk about, and really try to work with all our landowners and try to get them involved in education to really understand the benefits of what they can do, why they're doing it. And really, you know, I think that will infuse them as well to get people, you know, bought into the process. So, but I do agree I think we're somewhat behind when it comes to the whole education, skills, capability and capacity. But I think there still is an opportunity to turn the curve on that, but we do need to act now. And I think by, you know, some of the great demonstration projects that Clive showed, I think there's good evidence there already, albeit at a very small scale. But I think we need to get people out, and we've done it ourselves recently in Northern Ireland. We have our own department are running some peatland restoration work, and we've been out to see it, and we've brought our agricultural colleagues, and everybody is learning from that. And I think, you know, when people see it, they get it, they understand it. And I think we need to do the same with particularly with our farmers and our landowners. We need to actually get people out and show them what we're talking about. And I think, you know, even the term nature recovery, I think resonates better with our landowners than biodiversity even, and dare I say it, and I see people nodding, which is good. So lots to do, but I still would be positive that we can get there. But you're absolutely right, Claire. I think there is a capacity issue that we have to address.
And it's not just building new skills. Sophie and I spent a lot of time yesterday with a junior member of my team who's been part of the Future Generations Academy that Sophie's led. And Emily Rose is an engineer, and what she was talking about was the skills that she's learning as an engineer about engaging with communities. And I think that, you know, all the people who we work with are going to need to learn new skills around this engagement with the public and communities. I mean, Sophie, do you want to talk a bit about that? Because it's something I know you're passionate about.
Yeah, and Emily Rose has just been tweeting her insights from a return from COP actually, and some of the nature challenges that she's seeing on her journey home on the train. But I mean, the Future Generations Leadership Academy that I've established, I suppose, is trying to do what I was just describing earlier around making the connections. And Emily Rose, as you say, is an engineer. Other young leaders on that program, for example, Helen, who is a leader in Scouts Cymru, and what has happened through bringing those two unlikely people together, because when, as an engineer in NLW and previously she was in Transport for Wales, would you engage with the Scouts? But actually bringing those people together, what is now happening is that Emily Rose is working with Helen to develop a badge in eco-literacy and nature in the Scouts. Now, small, but could be scaled up. And I think when you start to make those connections, you know, beautiful things start to happen, and things start to grow. I think there's a bigger, more strategic piece, however, around skills, which is that we currently don't have the skills and massive gaps in industries that will be needed to restore nature, to deliver zero carbon and and restore biodiversity and so on. And I think we need to see this as a way of, you know, perhaps also engaging politicians who perhaps haven't been in this space. You know, there's that Trump quote from Biden, you know, Trump says hoax, I say jobs. And jobs are also, you know, often at the forefront of politicians' minds. We can have there's another debate to be had about whether that should be the case. But I think we need to be looking at how do we pair our understanding of what is needed to restore nature with the jobs that can be created or need to be created to do that, and take a long-term approach to developing skills pipeline around that. In Wales, I know there's similar work going on in England. We think that a national nature service could do that and could deliver multiple wins of nature restoration, whilst also creating high quality jobs. And you take that even further by targeting those jobs at marginalized communities, women, ethnic minority people, disabled people who are not in those industries. And that again is where you start to get those multiple wins.
Thank you, Sophie. And I suppose that whole community engagement and engaging with different sectors, different skills bases is something that, again, I started today in a session with the historic environment sector, and a lot of emphasis on the role that culture can play in engaging communities with issues around nature loss and the solutions. And I suppose be interested in who each of you think we should. You've talked about land managers, you talked about some other areas. I think it's that reaching beyond the usual suspects. And who do you think we should be engaging that perhaps we haven't been engaging to date? Marion.
I'm going to be slightly cheeky, Claire, and say I think the first part of the answer to your question is we also have to engage the usual suspects, including ourselves, because we are, you know, the conservation sector is fairly conservative, isn't it? You know, a lot of our SSSIs are listed for a very specific thing that might not be there in a nature-based solution. So I think we have to face up to that. And also, I'm mindful of a day I spent in one of the Northern National Parks recently, where there'd been a really bad flooding event. The water had come straight off the hill, down a channel, taken out a bridge, taken out a community hall, ruined homes. And I stood and looked at the hill behind me and said, well, you've got to plant trees up there. And there was a very sharp intake of breath, you know, that sense that this is going to mean changes to some of the landscapes and the nature we currently treasure. This means letting our landscapes evolve, become a bit wilder. And I think there's a very local community level of this. And I was very struck by what Sophie was saying about the urban aspect of this, and that bringing nature to people, nature-based solutions, not just being about climate change, but also being about health and well-being and social justice. But again, we face challenges with that, don't we? So I'm a big believer in what one of my colleagues rather nicely called micro-wilding, which is letting your road verges and your school grounds and your play parks and whatever just go a bit scruffy, just don't. But when that happens, there's a lot of opposition, isn't there? So there's something about work. So I think that would be my other answer to your question. I think we need to engage with communities, but not in the way that we often do, not going in and saying, here's a plan, please comment on it, sitting down and talking to people and say, what would you really like to see in the wildlife and in the nature where you live? And we're not very good at that either, because we know best, don't we, because we're scientists.
I think my garden would recognize the micro-wilding term. Clive, I mean, if you could sort of engage with a new and a different sort of sector or community, where do you think there might be some real benefit for, you know, what you talked about was about broadening that out, about bringing ENCA and EPA together and creating acronym soup all over the place. But actually that was about getting people who didn't normally talk to each other to talk to each other. Where would you like to see that move now?
Yeah, I think, yes, it was a bit of acronym soup, and I'm sure, but I think the key point is that you know, different people define nature-based solutions in different ways, and some people would genuinely see it as a threat. I mean, Marion just described the example of, well, plant trees, and so I think that, well, let's say two things. One is, I think, actually one of the, we touched on evidence, but I think we need to engage with social scientists to better understand how we engage communities and different sectors of communities. So we need to engage them, but I think we need to learn a bit about, you know, maybe through discussion with psychologists, to understand, you know, the compartmentalization of the different elements of society and how their attitudes to, like, planting trees or to restoring peatlands or other nature-based solutions, how that will impact. And I think in terms of the going back to us as agencies and the way we collaborate, I think there is definitely learning to be had through work. I mean, one of the strengths, I think, since we have begun to, initially, as I said, we were just the nature conservation bodies, but bringing in the environmental protection agencies and the forestry bodies and thinking whole landscape, that's been a real positive. But I think there's, you know, we need to broaden that probably further still, because I mean, Sophie was talking about how, you know, you're going through public health, but at the moment we're still the discrete environmental agencies. Quite how we do that, I don't know, but I think that's probably the challenge going forward.
Thank you very much. It's sort of taking over the world time. So Paul, who would you be looking in Northern Ireland to engage more with?
I should be on safer territory here as the Director of Rural Development for previous 10 years. So obviously Northern Ireland, as you probably know, has a different slant when it comes to communities. We have two communities, we have others, but as you know, everything's, but so I actually see, we've done a lot of work over the last 5 years on the rural side, and I appreciate there is urban communities as well, but in relation to green infrastructure, and that has actually been very positive, and we've an historic environment. So we've sort of used those. I think communities were very keen to get on board, and I suppose in Northern Ireland, about a non-contentious issue, but it's actually helped bring communities who traditionally wouldn't have collaborated, even on sport or things like that. But when it comes to green infrastructure and the environment, there is a real willingness out there for people to get involved, I think, for a common goal and that sort of pride, I think, in local is something that we can draw on as well. So I actually believe that, and you're right, in some cases, I think the social scientists could help as well, because it's not easy to engage communities. I think we have this perception, as somebody mentioned, you know, you send out a survey or you tell them what we're going to do. You know, you got to get boots on the ground, as we say. You got to get in there and build trust. I think trust is probably the key thing, and that takes time. You know, you might think, right, 6 months we'll roll out this capital scheme. You know, it takes time but I think it's time well spent and time well invested. But so I do believe, you know, and COVID and has been very tragic for a lot of people in a lot of communities, but it has got people more aware of nature and the world around them, and I think it's got people more appreciative of what actually is out there and what the action we have to take. So again, maybe I'm being over enthusiastic, but I think there is a real opportunity to get out there, but it isn't easy, and others have said it. You have to invest time and build that trust and allow communities, I suppose, then to take, you know, allow them to lead. But I really do think there definitely is a huge appetite out there for people to get involved in that common goal from all backgrounds.
Hugely powerful reminder, actually, that this is an area that brings communities together, and the importance of that sense of place. And I think that that's something that you know, we are hearing people talking much more about place-based solutions, and I think that, you know, in a Northern Ireland context, that could, I mean, can be really powerful.
Absolutely, and you know, don't want to overstate it, but you all know, I mean, we still have the situation in Northern Ireland in the main where communities sort of live, they coexist. You know,
Absolutely.
you know, and there's
two places, not one.
Absolutely, and there's peace, and it's all good, but it's coexisting. You know, so but we've seen some great examples recently whereby, you know, particularly in the green infrastructure and the outdoor recreation and the historic environment, where you can create that shared purpose, and I think that's what it's all about, and that's across, you know, newcomers and all communities. So really positive opportunity to do something different, and I think, you know, the narrative's there. There's very few people who can argue with it, you know, and that's why it's great to see the Nature Positive report and events like this here and bringing that together. So hugely positive, but a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Paul. Going to Clive and then Sophie, and then we might have time for the odd question.
Thanks. So I guess similar to others, I don't think I'd single out a particular constituency. I think, as Sophie indicated earlier, there's huge merit in being issue-led. What is the concern for the community, and how then can we help to address that? And I think earlier, Professor Pata Dasgupta would have been talking in the UK Pavilion about the economics of biodiversity. And in that report, he makes, you know, rightly, the point that economies need to be embedded in nature. So I think for me, what flows from that, well, a number of things flow from it, but one important thing is that what is the nature first solution to our problem, whatever that problem might be? And really we should be aiming to get into a position where we have to justify the departure from that nature first solution rather than having to justify the nature intervention that we want to make in the sort of conventional extractive economy that we currently have. So I think, you know, who is in the room making decisions tells you an awful lot about what kind of decisions are going to be made and the distribution of costs and benefits that flow from that. And, you know, that's been a big subtext for me. I've been here all week listening to various discussions and commentary on them and so on. And there's huge concern, obviously, about the degree to which the people most affected by climate change are here represented compared to the people who are causing the problem in the first place, as it were. So, and I think we can translate that global issue into the issue-led solutions that we're trying to find at community level. And as Sophie illustrated, bringing some unusual suspects into the room, creating with the diversity of thinking and viewpoints that brings, can help us all find solutions that are there. But I think being issue-led, I think, would be the key one for me.
Good, thank you. And Sophie?
Well, I suppose we're sort of fortunate that we've got a recipe in our Future Generations Act for the sort of people that we should be bringing together. Our Act sets out 7 long-term well-being goals, which are for a prosperous Wales, a more resilient Wales. Interesting terms there, actually, and I just want to say something about terms. Terms we use are thoroughly confusing. Resilience can mean emergency services. It can mean ecological resilience. It can mean personal resilience. And we use these terms. We use terms like ecosystem services, green infrastructure. Actually, when we're talking to communities, probably better saying, you know, would you like your suburbs to be leafy? You know, that's probably a better way of describing it. Sorry, I'll get off my rant about terminology and go back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. So focus on resilience, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a healthier Wales, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and a globally responsible Wales. So if you take each of those aspects, you would have people in the room who, yes, have expertise in nature. You would have business and people from the circular economy. You would have health professionals. You would have community activists. You would have creatives and cultural professionals. You would have people who might be involved in globally responsible NGOs, for example, because they will all bring a different perspective. And whatever it is you're coming up with, first off, I think, you know, they will force you to talk a language that everyone understands, and find what that collective language is. Secondly, I think that you bring those perspectives, or those different sort of perspectives, and you can find things, better ways of doing things that you'd never even thought of, because we don't know what we don't know. When you've been in a particular world and in a particular silo, you don't necessarily know how you could do what you're doing slightly differently to have multiple benefits and wins, or really importantly, to stave off any you know, negative or unplanned sort of impacts that whatever you're proposing to do might have. So I think if you almost use a sort of a bit of a checklist of as many of those people or representatives, that's another difficulty, how do you get representatives, but as many of those sort of voices in the room, then I think that's a pretty good starting point.
Thank you, Sophie. I think we've got time for a couple of questions. I've got one there. And yep. Sophie will hand you her microphone. Oh,
Hi, my name's Rachel. I'm from Scotland's Youth
I can't
Charity,
hear.
representing 2050 Climate Group. And I noted one of the key recommendations was to mobilise stakeholders and politicians on the value of nature-based solutions, but didn't really see young people coming out much in the discussion. And I just wanted to ask, where do you see young people being able to influence the discussions, and how can they get a seat at the table?
A very good question, and you know, one that I think this whole week has really, for me, brought home the importance of involving young people. But I'm going to ask Marion. Oh, right.
Young people. How to involve young people. Oh gosh, my slightly flippant comment is I think they're involved. But yeah, I guess the question is they have very strong worries about this, but are we actually engaging them and coming up with the right solutions? And again, it's something we're not very good at, the way we're not very good at engaging with communities and people beyond our current world. So the short answer is I don't know, but I think we need to do something about it quick. You know, we have a generation that cares, and we are being told from the highest, the loudest voices, aren't we, that we are failing them at the moment. I think the positive thing for me, we do a piece of research. We've been repeating it for a good 10 years. We do it 3 or 4 times a year about attitudes to use of nature. And we stepped it up during COVID. And we also added attitudes of young people to that. So what do they value about nature? And we saw the things you might expect, that especially during COVID, people more and more valuing local nature. We also saw the hard statistics that Sophie referred to earlier about the inequalities. But what we've seen in one we published a fortnight ago was, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but they were roughly in the lines of 80% of young people want to do more for nature. 40% of them don't think that we are. And I think that's quite sobering.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Sophie, but I think that one of the things that for me, you know, is how we just, young people are part of everything that we do. You know, they're part of the society we're all part of. They're part of the organizations that we all work for. It's giving them the ability to influence in all different ways, from within, from outside. And that is about us actually getting better at listening, I think. But Sophie.
Yeah. Well, in Wales, every school has an eco-council. That's a kind of really obvious route in terms of engagement. They're young people, pupils who are elected by their peers, representing each age group. And so there's you know, I don't see why every country couldn't have that in every school, and it's a ready-made forum. I think you know, there's something about the people who are within our organisations and how we actually value them. Part of the programme that Claire and I were just talking about, we delivered a reverse mentoring scheme. So Emily Rose, who we talk about, reverse mentored Claire, and there's something incredibly powerful about a young person coming and you know, eyeballing a current leader and asking them, why are you doing it like that, or why have you ignored this bit, or you know, those sorts of things. And we all have young people within our organizations who we're probably not utilizing that, you know, that sort of that forum of their voices as well. We probably don't have enough in our organizations in terms of, you know, savvy use of digital skills. Something really simple that I've seen recently which was actually about active travel, a platform for people to go on from anywhere in the area to say, this route, I don't cycle from here to here because this route is really dangerous and it's this junction. Gave them the ability to fill in online, you know, why it's a problem, and all of that kind of gets submitted. So I don't think it's rocket science. I think there are loads of different ways of doing it. But I think your point is really is the key one. We do not invest in it. We see, you know, engagement as consultation when we've decided something that we're going to do, and we've got to go through a process to consult. And then, you know, it's not surprising that communities go, whoa, you know, I'm not up for this. You know, I don't understand what's going on here. And then we'd rather spend our time unpicking those problems that then emerge, or us getting things wrong because we haven't done that, than actually investing the time upfront in the long-term engagement with communities. And I think, you know, from a UK context, there is something about austerity having stripped out probably from all of our services and all of our organisations the people who perhaps used to do that, and it's a complete false saving, because if we invested up front in that, we'd have much better solutions in the first place.
Thank you. Great question. Gentlemen at the back, are we all right for time?
Thank you. I work for the Ocean and Climate Platform. And so thank you for your presentation. And I'm still not very clear with one point about the governance of nature-based solutions. And I was asking myself, what is the right scale to implement them? And so I can understand that it's nice to implement it at a very, very small scale. Like this way we can consult the population, but it's also nice to have a very broad engagement of stakeholders at a regional scale, because we need coordination. So I work on the adaptation of coastal cities to sea level rise. And of course, nature-based solutions are part of the solutions, but it is we are always trying to mix and to combine gray solutions, managed retreats, and nature-based solutions. And in this context, what will be the good scale to implement it, but also to be able to engage the right people? Thank you.
What a fabulous question. Clive, I'm going to be very mean and bring that to you first. And then I thought maybe the other Clive will have a totally Clive-based solution.
No, it's a really good question. I think you're right in what you say, is that we actually need it to be at multiple levels. So to take your example around the coast, and to put it into a kind of a Welsh stroke UK, well, certainly I think Britain context, in terms of how we manage our coastal retreat, we have a system called shoreline management planning, and those shoreline management groups are very much kind of strategic and looking at what should be our decision making for each section of coast. But of course, that's really important, and it kind of provides the evidence base. But then, having done that at that larger scale, we then need to consult those communities that will be impacted. So I think you know, it is that combination of scale that we have to work at. And I mean, actually, one of the interesting things, a project that I'm involved with around climate change is called the Cherish Project, which actually is all about the historic environment and about how historic environment features such as forts, and in Wales, castles. You know, we've got more castles in Wales per land area than any other country. All these historic features are being, you know, some of them are under threat, and actually engaging communities in understanding that is helping them to then understand the need to adapt in coastal areas. So I think there's some quite innovative and different ways of engaging people. It's not just about the, you know, oh, well, here's our shoreline management plan, and this is what we think should happen. Let's go ahead and do it. So I think there are those kind of novel approaches that we can apply.
Thank you, Clive. And over to the other Clive.
Thanks. So yeah, I think it depends on the scale of the issue that you're looking at. So if I'm living in a town and concerned about the river running through my living room, I ought to be concerned about the management of the entire catchment, because that's what's going to control the amount of water that's going to come into the river through the town where I live. And similarly for coastal settings, it's the coastal cell probably that is going to determine the movement of sediments and the retreat or expansion of coastlines and so on. So I think understanding the scale at which we're trying to understand the problem should then tell us about who we need to engage in addressing the issue. And sometimes that could be quite small scale, and sometimes it's going to be quite large, and probably all things in between most of the time. Before I hand the mic back, I was just going to say, sorry, I didn't catch your name who asked the previous question, but I'd quite like to hear your answer to that question as well. If not now, then afterwards.
Really good. I am, I think, being encouraged to wind this up. It's a conversation that I feel has been continuing throughout this week. It will continue through next week and beyond to COP15 and beyond that. Something I think we need to keep it going. We need to act as well as talk. But I think that the discussion today, I have certainly found, has moved my thinking on, inspired me. And I think that's what we all take away from these things. We go back to where we're working and we are inspired, we're engaged, we have made new networks, we have been challenged, which is great. So a huge thank you to everyone involved, to Pete and Clive for their presentations. Paul had to shoot off, but Sophie, thank you very much. Clive, Marion, and thank you to all of you for your engagement.
You were saying about in England they're funding tribes projects.